During the Enlightenment, we have these three really famous composers. And it's not that there weren't lots and lots of other composers there were, but these three guys pretty much crystallized the time period. And they start with a guy named Franz Joseph Haydn. He was born in a little town in Austria called Rorau, and that was on the border with Hungary. And of course, this is the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time, so that's really kind of in the middle of things. But it was a small town, wasn't not an important place. His dad, Matthias, was a wheelwright. He built wheels for carriages and things. And he was also pretty much the mayor of the town. It's a weird little title, and you don't need to worry about that. Neither of his parents could read music. They were not musicians. But they were enthusiastic about folk music. And his dad played harp by ear, not by sight. And according to Haydn's own reminiscences, his family was filled with music, but it was not academically music. Well, his parents noticed that he was gifted and talented in this, and so they decided that they would let him go over and work with the schoolmaster, the choir master in Haydnburg. And that's when he started his training as a musician. Well, it was not an easy life. He studied, he worked, he went hungry a lot of times, but he finally got to the point where he was a good enough musician that they took him for the cathedral and the cathedral choir. And that was a much better deal. He continued to study, he continued to learn, and then his voice broke, which happened to all young men at some point in time. And it was like, okay, we don't need you in the choir anymore. They have monks for the choir. So the boys' voices, which were doing the soprano line, because women were not allowed to sing in the choir at that point in time. Bye. Off you go. Well, he had learned how to play violin, and he was able to go along and become a freelance musician. What's that basically mean? Well, you went from town to town and place to place, and you served when they needed more people in the orchestra. Not a great time. He learned how to play organ when he was studying. He learned how to play violin. He learned how to compose. He was an up-and-coming young person. He had the possibilities, and he was willing to keep working on it. And so he worked from one little job to another little job to another little job. Not a bad deal. He eventually ends up with a job as Kapellmeister, master of the chapel choir, head of liturgical music. Little orchestra for a count. And it worked well. He wrote his very first symphonies while he was doing this job. And they're cute. They're, about 12 minutes long or so. You can listen to the whole thing very quickly. They are not what we would call musically sophisticated today, but they are very clearly part of this time period. His use of the forms is spot on, does exactly what you expect. There are 4 movements, a fast movement, a slow movement, a minuet, and another fast movement again. Well, eventually he gets hired by Nicholas Esterházy, and I've told you in class a number of times, Esterházy was fabulously wealthy. We're talking a really rich guy, more spendable money than the emperor. Why? Well, the emperor was basically having to supply all of his armies to protect them from the people they were fighting with, who was the Turkish Empire at that time. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Turkish Empire were pushing back and forth on those borders in Eastern Europe, which is why most Americans have never heard of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because we're used to those people who were dealing with the far west, France and Spain and Portugal and England, all of those countries that ended up coming this direction, whereas Austro-Hungary was always pushing back against the Turks on the eastern side of Europe. Well, Haydn started his deal working for the Esterházys, and he works for Nicholas Esterházy for some 30 years. And as he goes along, he gets more and more responsibility, more and more pay. Not a bad deal. Esterházy provides him with a benefice, a retirement benefit, for when he dies. And when Esterhazy passes away, Haydn gets his retirement, he gets this benefit, and he goes off and he continues his career going to London, among other places, and probably being the single most famous musician in his time period. Not a bad thing. It's fun to look back at Haydn and think of just what a stability this man had and how many people he taught. He taught lots of folks, taught lots of lessons, and lots of his musicians grew up to be important musicians in other places. I forgot to mention that Haydn was born in 1732 and he dies in 1809. So there's this huge amount of time that this man is performing and writing music and being influential in the music world. Now, the next person who comes along is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Mozart does not live as long as Haydn, and he is a fabulously important composer. He's born in 1756 and he dies in 1791. Not very old. Now his whole name, poor little child gets this name, Johannes Chrysostomos Wolfgangus Theophilis Mozartus. John Chrysostom, who's a saint in the Eastern Orthodox Church, Wolfgang, Theophilus, which gets changed later to the Latin version, that's a Greek version, gets later changed to Amadeus. Theophilus and Amadeus both mean the same thing, lover of God. So his dad hangs this great big long name on Mozart and then starts to train him to be a musician. His father had the same sort of job that Haydn had. He was the head musician for the Prince Archbishop of Salzburg. And Salzburg was a pretty important place in the time. It was not as important a place as Vienna. It was not the crown jewel in the center of the universe. It's a little like people might consider New York City and Boston. You know, New York City is the place you go. It's the, that's, if I can make it in New York, I can make it anywhere. And Boston is a really nice city and it has lots of stuff and it's really cool, but it doesn't have that same drive in a lot of people's minds that New York City has. Well, the same was for Salzburg. Salzburg is a gorgeous city. I've been there. It's just an absolutely beautiful place. But it's not quite as cool as Vienna. So Mozart grows up being taught as if he were a nobleman's child. This causes him some problems as time goes on, because he grows up thinking he is more privileged than he actually is, which is not a problem for the longest time because the Prince Archbishop of Salzburg loves music and finds little Mozart absolutely charming and lets him get away with all kinds of stuff. And you've probably seen that with people before. There's some little kids who can get away with just about anything because they're so cute, they're so fun, they're so whatever it is that that little kid has, and everybody lets them get away with it. Well, Mozart got away with a lot of things. He was also incredibly gifted as a musician. Now, his father at times pushed him really incredibly hard. He was a taskmaster. He was you're going to do this and you're going to learn this. And by the time he was a little kid, he was learning all kinds of things. And his dad would get up in the morning and play the major minor seventh chord. And little Mozart would hear that, and his dad would leave the room, and little Mozart would get up and go over and go, because he couldn't leave it on that unresolved seventh chord. He had to go over and resolve it. So that's the way his dad would wake him up in the morning. It's kind of a strange musical thing to do to the child. Well, Mozart grew up, the world is his oyster. Everything that he wanted to try, he was allowed to try musically. He wrote for a little seaside orchestra when he was like 13 years old. Wonderful little piece of music. I wish I could write music as nice as he did as he wrote when he was a kid. He grew up to write more things. He wrote pieces for individual instruments. He wrote pieces for orchestra. He wrote full operas. And all of it absolutely charming. There is a grace to Mozart's writing that nobody else gets quite as well. There is something about Mozart's way of handling dissonance and his way of cutely bringing you where he wants you to go. Almost always with a little twist to it, almost always with a little bit of extra grace. Sometimes when we think of Haydn, we think of Beethoven, we think of kind of a ploddingness, a left, a right, a left, a right, because they were both brought up in very homespun, uh, peasant sort of families. Whereas Mozart was brought up among the upper class, and he has this whole idea of grace, and it just seems to flow from his music. Sadly, his life is not filled with grace. When the Prince Archbishop dies, the new Prince Archbishop gets installed, and he's not having anything with Mozart. And you can read the sadness in the story of his life, and his mother dying, and him getting thrown out of the court. Eventually, he works his way to Vienna, which is where everybody wants to go anyway. And he actually ends up with a little tiny part-time job with the small orchestra, sort of incidental music of the emperor. And he's working as a part of Salieri's staff in some respects in that way. And one would have hoped that he would have grown and gotten older, and eventually Salieri would have retired and Mozart would have ended up with the job. But it didn't work out that way. Mozart dies at a young age, pretty much from living too hard. He did things he shouldn't have done. He hung out too late at night. He did too much drinking. He did some carousing. Okay, he did a lot of carousing. And eventually he dies. Like 35 years old. Not a very long life. He leaves behind 2 children and his wife. And in one of the most poignant letters that still exist, his wife wrote the emperor, and she's like, look, my husband didn't take a lot of other jobs because he wanted to work for you. He wanted to work in your court. Your court was the place to be. But because of that, I don't have a retirement benefit from anybody. And so she asks him for Mozart's sons and for herself to have a retirement benefit. And the emperor graciously gives her that retirement. So that was a cool thing. There's a whole collected series of letters from Mozart to his wife and from her to him. And this is the last letter in that. She has written to the emperor asking his help. Mozart is a style unto himself in some respects. Later, there's going to be a couple of people who are almost as good, almost as graceful. Rossini will manage that. But we're going to see in this next time period, this Sturm und Drang, this storm and stress, which has nothing to do with the gracefulness of Mozart. Ludwig van Beethoven. Okay, that sounds like a really important, impressive name, but he actually adds the van himself, which is an honorific sort of like, lord. He's doing a little self-aggrandizement. And it's kind of amusing when you realize that Beethoven is literally Beet Garden. So it's Ludwig of the Beet Garden is what he's called himself. It's a little tongue-in-cheek with that and a little uppityness of it at the same time. We're not exactly sure what day he was born. He was baptized on the 17th of December in 1770. And he dies on the 26th of March in 1827. And that's why we close out this time period in 1827, because the death of Beethoven pretty much brings to an end anything officially classical and Viennese classical in this time period. He is not the average composer, and you've heard me say that before. He's not the regular person. He is in many respects a person with one foot in the classical era and one foot in the romantic era. So he's going to be going back and forth between these two ideas. And with his death, the romantic era takes over. And he's had a whole lot of pushing it to get there. He's born in Bonn, in what today would be Germany. And let's see, his dad taught him to begin with. Not the nicest of teachers, pretty strict taskmaster, pretty forceful in what he was doing. And later, he has a composer and conductor, Christian Gottlob Neff, and he published his first works for keyboard, while he was working with this composer in 1783. They weren't really that great. He made friends with another family, and he sort of escaped from his family and went over to his friend's house all the time and had a more normal life because of that. I think a lot of us have managed that over the years. My own family and my best friend's family, I spent probably as much time at my best friend's house as I did at my own house. Well, at the age of 21, he makes the decision to move to Vienna. Everything circles around Vienna. So why not go there? So he does. And he starts to study composition there with, among other people, Haydn. Haydn is not that impressed with Beethoven at this point in time. Now, he's 21 years old, and usually by the time you were 21, you should really have become a pretty good musician. And he was a kind of a mediocre musician. He wrote a number of things when he was there. He wrote things for particular people, and he was given money to continue doing so, and managed to keep body and soul together, as it were, and continue to learn. His first major orchestral work, his First Symphony, which is a beautiful symphony, by the way, shows up in 1800. Now, we're not sure when he actually wrote it, but it's actually, out there, and we know in 1800 it's there. He wrote his first string quartets, and they show up published in ways that people get hold of them in 1801. His hearing begins to deteriorate. He's just beginning to write really great music, and his hearing is going. Fortunately, he can hear in his head. He can audiate. He continues working on things, never ends up getting married. He was very popular among the women. He was a rock star in his day. He was very close to one of his nephews, who tries to commit suicide, and he's forever marked by that. He ends up having two sides of his personality coming back and forth, and it shows up really, really clearly in his symphonic works. His First Symphony is very, very classical in its manner of being put together. Pretty much, it was his first try into that kind of a thing. His Fifth Symphony, his Third Symphony, his Seventh Symphony, and his Ninth Symphony, all the odd-numbered symphonies, are very stretching. They're doing new things. The Third Symphony starts off as an honor to Napoleon. He's thinking, here's Napoleon, here's this guy who's, just a regular person who's showing us that kings aren't important, that nobility's not important. And then Napoleon takes and crowns himself emperor, and Beethoven scratches out the original title, which was Bonaparte, scratches that out, and he changes the name to Eroica, or heroic. And it's an absolutely gorgeous symphony. And you'll listen to it, and it starts off not with the violins playing the melody, but with the cellos playing the melody. Beautiful, beautiful work. His Fifth Symphony is incredibly well known. You all know the bum 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 bum. And we're going to listen to the entire Fifth Symphony, so I won't give you the whole recap of that right now. But it does all kinds of strange things that it's not supposed to do. The Ninth Symphony, he grabs a choir and sticks it into the orchestra. Now, we've had orchestral music supporting choirs before, but now we've got choir added as an orchestral instrument. His second, his fourth, his sixth, and his eighth symphonies are much more classical in the way they're put together, much more like something Haydn would have written. And it's almost like, is this the same person? Well, he's thinking this one way, then he's thinking this way, then he's thinking this one way, then he's thinking this way. Not entirely unexpected. As an absolute lover of piano, he loved the fact that he could play everything on piano. He could hear it all at once. He had absolute control over it, which you don't have when you're doing a symphony. When you're doing a symphony, you write it and then you hope that the people out there are going to perform it the way you want it to be. When you're playing it on piano, you have control over that. He liked loud, big, bangy music, and he broke pianos. He broke piano strings and he broke pianos. The Bösendorfer Piano Company, which made most of the pianos that he loved playing on, is still around today and still makes some of the finest pianos in the world. The piano that Beethoven played on had 72 keys, and it stops there. Our modern piano has 88 keys, and I'll tell you a little story about that in class one day. It's kind of a slick story. Be listening for that one. Beethoven takes us different places than we were expecting to go. He's very much involved with this idea of expressing emotion. Now, here we're talking about in the classical time period where everything has been so circumscribed and square and A, B, A, C, A, and he wants to break out of that. He's constrained by it and pushing it to its level, and that's why I say, in Beethoven you'll hear that the tail wags the dog. His coda is sometimes longer than the entire piece of music because there's things he wanted to do. Well, I had to do A, B, A, C, A, and now I can write the coda and I can write anything I want. And he does that on a regular basis. He's an exciting human being. He's a lot of energy, and he could not care less what you thought about him. If you thought he was wonderful, great, come sit, enjoy the concert. If you didn't think he was wonderful, that's fine, go away. That's a different way of looking at music than anybody did up to this time. And it's a freedom that all musicians since then have been granted. So long as you're willing to pay for your own way, you can do the music that you want to do. And in some respects, we owe all of that to Ludwig van Beethoven.